Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Childe's skills have been translated to English, and so I wanted to make a video going over his moveset. And man, look at this guy. He is such a pretty boy. Look at those nice blue eyes. And his name is actually Tartaglia Childe. We call him Childe, but I guess his given name was Tartaglia. Yuhang of the Liwei Chising. Yeah, I think this is a typo. MiHoYo officials gotta step up their game here. Let's take a look at some of his official animations. So this is posted by MiHoYo officially, and to be honest, they do kind of look kind of basic and pretty bland in terms of ult animations, but I don't mind that because after reading the translated skills, he looks like a dope character. I was thinking that his hydro weapons were just going to be quick one-time animations for his elemental skill and his burst, but I was wrong. And I am super glad that I was wrong because he looks like an absolute beast. And I am super excited to pull him. So let's dive into his translated skills. First, his basic attack is just basic. It shoots 6 arrows at the enemies. Nothing really to go in depth there. His charge attack is a fully charged arrow that will deal water damage and apply something called Broken Flow, which is a debuff that is only for Childe. So what is Broken Flow? Broken Flow right here says AoE hydro damage will be dealt to all nearby enemies of the target when any enemy under the effect of Broken Flow is hit by any of Childe's attacks. This damage is calculated as regular attack damage. I don't really know why they felt the need to say this is regular attack damage. I don't know why that's needed to be said, but we'll talk about Broken Flow in a little bit more detail in a little bit, so sit tight. His elemental skill unleashes equipment made of water, dealing hydro damage to all nearby enemies and enters melee stance. So he changes stances and becomes a melee character. His entire moveset changes when you use his elemental skill. I did not expect Childe to have stances. And so me personally, I love stance characters. I play fighting games, and this reminds me of Leo from Guilty Gear. And basically, I love the gameplay loop on stance characters. It's like playing 2 characters in one because the gameplay loop is like playing one stance so that it leads into the next stance, but the powerful stance is only good if you play the previous stance well enough. So yeah, it's kind of confusing, but even if he turns out to be bad, he looks fun as hell to play, and I am excited to pull him. Okay, so when he enters melee stance, he becomes a melee character, and he gets regular attacks and charge attacks, and he gets this thing called Broken Flow Slash. His normal and charge attacks behave just like other melee characters, so there isn't much to go into detail there. But this Broken Flow Slash, so this works the same way as Broken Flow Bow, and all you gotta do is hit an enemy that has the debuff and it will cause AoE hydro damage. However, in this stance, it doesn't say that it applies Broken Flow, so you'll need to apply Broken Flow first before using your elemental skill. So this could hinder his DPS a little bit and kind of change the playstyle of how he applies Broken Flow, but he does have a passive that will get around this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this goes back to what I was saying about stance characters earlier, in that you have to play both stances effectively in order to make the character shine. Okay, let's talk about his elemental burst, and he has 2 depending on which stance he's in. So when he's in his ranged stance or his bow stance, he shoots a magical arrow containing hydro elemental power, dealing AoE hydro damage while also applying Broken Flow to all enemies that are hit. This ult also refunds partial elemental energy after use. So this ult is pretty good. I mean, using it will just refund the amount of elemental energy, so it kind of just like chains into itself, but there's a better use for it, and I'll go into that in just a little bit. And this is probably going to be the best way and the most quick way to apply Broken Flow, because it'll be fast and you don't need to aim your charged shot. Okay, his melee stance elemental burst performs a wide slash, dealing tremendous hydro damage to all nearby enemies while also triggering Broken Flow Burst. So Broken Flow Burst, what is it exactly? AoE hydro damage that will be dealt when enemies under Broken Flow is hit with melee elemental burst. broken flow will be consumed in the process. So the wording here is a little bit confusing, but it just means that enemies need to be debuffed with broken flow first, and then they will take the broken flow burst damage. I know the word broken flow is being used a lot here, but bear with me. Broken flow and broken flow burst are two different things. And so we can assume that broken flow burst does much more damage than the regular broken flow. It doesn't exactly say that inside this translation, so that's only an assumption, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption. This also implies that the regular broken flow does not get consumed when you hit enemies with your normal attacks, so that's good. It's just extra damage forever how long the debuff lasts. Okay, let's talk about his Ascension passives. So Ascension 1, broken flow duration increased by 8 seconds. That's great. That's awesome. But what is the original debuff timer? That's what I'm curious about. It doesn't exactly say that inside this translation, so I think we'll just have to wait to find that out. Ascension 4 passive. Crits in melee stance apply a broken flow. This is what I wanted to talk about and how this will help Childe's gameplay. Before we talked about how the melee stance could hinder his DPS because he couldn't apply broken flow, but with this passive, if he hits a crit, then he will apply broken flow while in melee stance. So Childe, you'll probably want to build him for crit chance so that you can apply broken flow while in melee stance. Alright, his utility passive is that he gives all active team members normal attack talent level increase by 1. I personally don't think this is too great because it's just the normal attack talent. If it was all of the talents, I think that'd be really good. So most of the time you'll be using one main DPS, and that will be the main character that uses normal attacks, and the supports will usually be using their elemental skills to support your main DPS. But I'm not trying to say that this passive is absolutely useless, because more DPS is more DPS. So that translation didn't have Constellation information, but the comments in this thread had a translated version of his Constellation, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. And I specifically want to talk about Constellation 0 Childe's gameplay before we go into this. So at Constellation 0, Childe's gameplay loop will be to apply broken flow to as many opponents as possible, then use broken flow burst to deal massive AoE damage. And so currently there's 3 ways to apply broken flow as Childe: melee stance crits, bow aimed charge shots, and his ranged elemental burst. So the 2 best ways when you're at C0 will be to use his melee stance crits and the ultimate. But when the melee stance is on cooldown, you'll be stuck with your bow charge shots. So it's kind of the downside of that. But his ranged elemental burst refunds energy, so it's practically built to apply broken flow and then quickly regain his ult again, so that you can use the melee stance burst. So at C0, you'll probably be seeing yourself in melee stance trying to get crits to apply broken flow, and then when you're on cooldown, you'll have to rely on your bow aim charge shots to apply broken flow. And then obviously just use your melee burst to deal as much damage as you can when there's as many broken flow debuffs applied on the enemy as possible. This is going to require efficient use of his elemental skill because broken flow burst is only available while he is in melee stance. Okay, so now his Constellation. So C1 reduces his E cooldown by 20%. So this means you can just get into melee stance more often, which is great, because I think melee stance is going to be his #1 way of dealing DPS. Knocking down enemies affected by his debuff restores 4 energy. I think this is also great, but the term knocking down enemies is not really clear. I don't know what that means exactly, so we'll just have to see what that means. But restoring 4 energy for whenever this happens is great because his ult is a very important part of his gameplay. Every 4 seconds, enemies affected by his debuff will take an extra hit, and the kind of hit depends on whether or not he's in melee or ranged stance. So this is just extra DPS, so this is great. When using Q in melee stance, it completely resets the cooldown of his E. This takes into effect once Tartaglia leaves melee stance. So his final Constellation seems to allow him to stay in his melee stance seemingly forever if you manage your cooldowns correctly. The loop goes like this: you enter melee stance, you deal elemental damage, and gather a bunch of elemental particles by causing reactions with the hydro damage, unleash your Q and reset your elemental skill, and then you go right back into melee stance. So yeah, C6 Childe seems to be like an absolute monster to me, and I am so excited, but I'm definitely not gonna be able to pull 6 Childes, so that's just gonna be a pipe dream, but I can dream, right? Okay, so now let's go into a little bit more information on his E. There was a screenshot posted of this talent, and here it is. So let's kind of dive into how this skill works a little bit more. So you can see that the melee stance has a max of 30 seconds at level 2, and hopefully when you level this up more, it goes up. And there's also this preemptive cooldown, meaning that there's probably a mechanism to deactivate his melee stance prematurely, but we don't know what that is. And there's also this max cooldown, so staying in melee stance will probably mean that you have a longer cooldown on his ability the longer you stay in melee stance. So his gameplay becomes a matter of maintaining balance on his elemental skill so that you have his melee ultimate ready to deal as much damage as possible when you have broken flow applied to as many enemies as possible. And so that's pretty much all that there is for Childe and all of his translated skills. Again, he looks so fun. I really want to pull this guy and try him out. And so, oh my gosh, guys, I want to know what banner you're going to pull. I want to know if you think Childe is going to be fun to play. Let me know if you are going to try and pull for Childe in the comments down below. But I think I've covered pretty much everything. And so, yeah, I will see you guys later.